The horror is that he did everything right and it didn't matter. That's a different kind of story, a more disturbing one, and for some readers, a more honest one. Every writing teacher you've ever had, every screenwriting guru, every craft book since 1949, they basically all tell you the exact same thing, that your protagonist must change, must grow, must transform, must begin the story as one person and end in a completely different person. It's so ubiquitous that we don't even question anymore. It's just what stories are. The character arc, the transformation, the growth. But what if that's a trap? What if the demand that the protagonist transform isn't a narrative truth, but a comfort mechanism? A lie that we tell ourselves because the alternative is far too disturbing to sit with. I wrote a novel built on that question. A protagonist who goes through hell, external arc fully intact, but doesn't change. Can't change, already tried. And I'm going to tell you why that works. Why the hero's journey, as we've been taught it, is missing something fundamental. So in 1949, Joseph Campbell published The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And whether you read it or not, you've definitely absorbed it because it's basically the water that we swim in, so to speak. Campbell identified what he called the monomyth, which is a universal story structure he claimed appeared across all cultures, which is true, I think. And it's called the hero's journey. The beats, the ordinary world, the call to adventure, crossing the threshold, tests and allies, the ordeal, the reward, and then finally the return. And then woven through all of that is transformation, the transformation. Hero leaves as one person and then comes back as a completely different person. Simba becomes king. Luke becomes Jedi. Frodo's broken, but even that's framed as growth. The point is that they are changed by the journey. So then came the systematizers. We've got Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, which turned Campbell into a formula. Beat sheets, page counts, and always, the protagonist must have a flaw in the beginning that they overcome by the end. And then we have Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, which did the exact same thing for Hollywood. The memo that he wrote in Disney in the 1980s became the template for virtually every blockbuster since. And here's what they all agree upon. Character growth is non-negotiable. It's not optional. It's not one approach among many. It is literally the thing that makes a story a story. Without it, you don't have a story. I've been in workshops, and just about everybody that I've ever talked to that's been in workshops where, people said with complete and total confidence that if your character doesn't change, you do not have a story at all. We've seen movies where someone tried to rebel against that and then suddenly figured out that, you don't have a story without it. You have a character study at best. Now, I want you to hold that thought in your mind, right? The certainty, the confidence, because I'm about to argue that it's not just wrong, it's suspiciously wrong. It's wrong in a way that serves a function. Let's start with the exceptions, though, because they do exist, and we don't talk about them enough. So first of all, we have the one that people have been talking about lately, but it's not a protagonist. Can't be. Which is Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. He's one of the most terrifying antagonists in modern fiction. He doesn't change. He doesn't grow. He's the same remorseless force at the end that he was at the beginning. The Coen brothers didn't even try to give him an arc, and it won 4 Academy Awards. We've got Sherlock Holmes, who across 100 years of adaptations, Holmes remains Holmes. Brilliant, difficult, unchanging. The stories work not because he transforms, but because he doesn't. He's a fixed point that the chaos of each case sort of swirls around. And then we have most of Greg Egan's protagonists. If you haven't read Egan, it's hard science fiction, uncompromising, and brilliant. His characters often begin with a clear understanding of their situation and then end still understanding it. The drama isn't will they learn, it's will understanding be enough. Now, defenders of the orthodoxy will say those are exceptions, genre fiction, not real literary stories. But here's what bothers me about that defense is that it assumes that character growth is somehow more true, right? More reflective of reality, more honest about the human condition. And again, we've seen movies about that process. I would ask you, is it though? Think about the people that you know, right? Your family, your friends, and even yourself. How many of them have fundamentally transformed? Not just changed their circumstances, transformed, became different people with different values and different ways of seeing the world. You know, some, sure, but most people are remarkably consistent. The patterns that define them at 25 define them at 45. The insights that they resist at 30, they're still resisting them at 60. It's not a moral judgment. It's just an observation. So, my question is, why then do we demand that fictional characters do something most real people never do? I think it's because we need to believe that it's possible. Character transformation in fiction, it's a comfort mechanism. It tells us that change is always available, growth is always possible, and no matter how stuck you feel, the narrative will provide a crucible that forges you into something new. And that's beautiful. It's hopeful. It's also, in many cases, if not most, a lie. So here's my heresy. What if we kept everything about the hero's journey except the internal transformation? So the character arc stays intact, the call, the threshold, the ordeal, the return, all of it. But the internal arc, the character growth, is severed. The protagonist doesn't change because they can't, or because they already tried, and the world made it literally impossible, or because they were right from the beginning and changing would have been the mistake. I call this the fixed-point protagonist. And before you say, well, that's just a flat character, right? Let me be precise about what I mean here. A flat character is static because the author didn't bother to develop them, right? They're a placeholder, a function. Like you might do that as you're writing just to get some other point across, right? A fixed point protagonist, on the other hand, is static by design. Their unchanging nature is the point. It's what generates the tragedy or the horror or whatever effect, that you're reaching for. The difference is intentionality. So when I started writing the Quamhoc Anomaly, I didn't set out to make a theoretical point about narrative structure. I was just trying to write a character who felt true to me. His name is Alias, and he knows how the story ends. All of it. Not metaphorically, not some vague intuition. Like he's seen it clearly for years, exactly what's coming. Collapse, catastrophe, the systems that hold civilization together failing in ways that most people can't even conceptualize. And so he tells people, he warns them, and he builds contingencies. And, they don't listen because, of course they don't. And, that's what Cassandras are for, to be right and be ignored. Now, in a conventional story, this is where Alias would grow. He'd learn humility. He realized that he was too arrogant, too certain, too unwilling to meet people where they are. He'd soften, he'd doubt himself, and through that doubt, he'd find a way to connect. And maybe together they would avert the disaster. And that's the story that we're trained to expect. Here's what actually happens in my book. Aelius tried that. During the story, he tries therapy, he tried humility, he tried softening his edges and doubting his conclusions and being open to being wrong. But every single time that he did, the disaster still happened. In his models and his projections and every possible simulation they could run, the softening didn't help. The doubt didn't help. The humility didn't help. The only thing that helped was being right and acting on it with certainty. So, his certainty isn't arrogance, it's scar tissue. It's what's left after you've tried the alternative and watched it fail. After you've done the growth the narrative demanded and discovered it was the trap all along. The demand to doubt himself, that was the mechanism of his destruction. Every time he listened, things got worse. So he stopped. And the novel follows him from there. External arc intact, internal transformation severed. He begins certain, he ends certain. The world burns him around him exactly as he predicted. The tragedy is not that he was wrong. The tragedy is that he was right. So why does this work as a narrative? If we've been told our entire lives that character growth is essential, why does removing it create something powerful rather than something empty? Well, I'll give you 3 reasons. First, we're used to stories where the protagonist's flaw causes the disaster and their growth resolves it. That's satisfying. It's a closed loop. Problem and solution live in the same person. But a fixed point protagonist breaks that loop. When Aelius is right from the beginning, when his flaw of certainty is actually correct, then the disaster has no resolution. There's no, if only we had learned sooner, there's no redemption available through personal change. The horror is that he did everything right. The horror is that he did everything right and it didn't matter. That's a different kind of story, a more disturbing one, and for some readers, a more honest one. Second, everyone watching this has had the experience of being right and being dismissed. Maybe it was small. You saw a project failing and nobody listened. Maybe it was big, where you warned someone about a relationship, a decision, a path, and they ignored you until it was too late. But that experience is almost never represented honestly in fiction. Because in fiction, the person who thinks they're right is almost always humbled. They're taught that their certainty was arrogance, and then they learn to listen. But see, the thing is that sometimes you are right, and the listening that you needed to do was to yourself. A fixed point protagonist gives that experience a voice. It says your certainty might not be the problem. The people demanding you doubt yourself might be the problem. Third, when a protagonist can't change to solve the problem, the audience then has to sit with a very different kind of question. And that question would be, what if the problem can't be solved, right? Or more precisely, what if the problem can't be solved by individual transformation? So again, most stories locate the cause and the cure inside the protagonist's psyche. That's comforting. It means, everything is within your control. Just grow, just change, just learn the lesson, and things will work out. A fixed point protagonist, however, refuses that comfort. Aelius can't change his way out of the collapse. All he can do is see it clearly, prepare for it, and try to save whoever will listen. Because the cause is systemic, not personal, right? And no amount of individual transformation will fix a systemic failure. That's a very different kind of story. And I think it's the kind we need more of. Now, I want to be careful here, okay? I'm not saying character growth is bad. I'm not saying transformation arcs are wrong. Some of my favorite stories are built on them because, well, basically they all are. What I'm saying is that the insistence on growth, the treatment of it as mandatory, as the definition of story itself, closes off an entire category of narrative. And, that category might be exactly what some stories need. So here's my challenge to you. If you're a writer, think about your protagonist. Think about their arc. Now ask, what if they were right from the beginning? Not arrogant, not in need of humbling, just right. Clear-eyed, accurate. What happens to your story if their certainty isn't the flaw, it's the asset? What happens if the tragedy isn't that they were wrong, but that being right wasn't enough? And here's my challenge to you if you're a reader or a viewer. Notice how you react to characters who don't change. Notice if you feel discomfort. Notice if you want them to learn something, to be humbled, to grow. And then ask yourself, why do I want that? Is it because the story would be better? Or is it because their certainty threatens something in me? Because if they can be right without softening, without doubting, without the performance of humility, what does it say about the times I've demanded that performance from others? Joseph Campbell gave us a very powerful tool. The hero's journey maps something very real about the human experience, but it's not the only map. And the part we've treated as the sacred, the internal transformation, might be the part we most need to question. Some heroes don't journey inward. Some heroes are fixed points, and their stories might be the ones we need most right now. I wrote a book about one of them. It's called Origins. It's the first book in the Quamhoc Anomaly. And if anything I've said here resonated, if you've ever been right and been told to doubt yourself, you might find something in it. The link's in the description. I look forward to your comments and feedback, and thank you for watching.